And I want to talk for 20 or 30 minutes about The Good Citizen. The subtitle is A History of American Civic Life. It's not a book that's going to teach you to be a good citizen. I don't claim any expertise at that. It's going to, however, help you think about, I hope, help you think about citizenship and the ways in which it has changed over American history. My claim is that if we learn something about that, we may have a very different evaluation of the state of citizenship and the affairs of citizenship in our own day. Is American civic participation, is the quality of American citizenship rising or falling? I want to suggest to you that that's the wrong metaphor, that assumes that there is one-dimensionality to citizenship. And I want to suggest that American citizenship is neither rising nor falling. It's changing. It's in a moment of transition. You might think of citizenship as changing states, like H2O. Sometimes it's ice, sometimes it's water, sometimes it's steam. If it's water, you might criticize it for a variety of reasons. It might be too hot, might be too cold, might be too cloudy, but you're not going to criticize it for being difficult to skate on. That's what you do with ice. Different states of H2O call forth different criteria to evaluate, and that's what I want to claim about citizenship. I want to quickly walk you through what I see as the 4 stages of citizenship in American history, how they differed, why they've changed, and then suggest what this implies for citizenship and civic participation in our own time. Let me take you back, first of all, to the colonial period of American history. In particular, I want to have you think yourself into colonial Virginia, where Madison, Washington, Jefferson learned what citizenship was. And they learned it by doing it, the same way most of us learn citizenship. We learned a lot on Tuesday going to the polls. They learned something by going to the polls too. Here's what happened when you went to the polls in colonial Virginia. You went to the one polling place in your county or parish, some distance from home, very likely. You were, of course, a white male property owner to begin with. Otherwise, you weren't there. You weren't at the polls. This is worth recalling to begin with. When you got to the polling place, usually outdoors, the sheriff at a table conducting the election, the 2 candidates there for office, the House of Burgesses, George Washington, say, and some rival, standing by the sheriff. And you go up to the sheriff and you say out loud, "I'm voting for George Washington." And then you walk over to George and he hands you a glass of rum or rum punch. It's not a bribe. I mean, if you had voted for the other guy, that you would have got the rum punch from him too. And the act of voting was an act of reaffirming a social hierarchy. How did we know that George was supposed to run? He's one of the leading landowners in town. It was sort of understood that one or another of the leaders of the community would stand for office, not run for office, stand for office. There was no kissing babies. There was no shaking hands. You just announced that you were available that time. And what was the job of the citizen in that regard? Was this an informed citizen? Not by our standards at all. What a citizen was supposed to know was really very little. The candidates didn't say where they stood on the issues. There weren't issues. The only thing the citizen had to know was who's a man of character, who's a man who commands social respect in my community, and that's who you vote for. In the way in which, in the early years of American history, people set up our system, it was clear that the informed citizen was not at the forefront of people's thinking. There was no establishment of public education in the first generation or two of the American Republic. The U.S. Senate met entirely in secret for its first several years. There was a taboo on electioneering. You weren't supposed to go before the people to tell them why to vote for you. And as for the press, the Founding Fathers were rather ambivalent about it. It's true, they wrote the First Amendment establishing freedom of the press, but particularly to make it clear that the Congress, this new national government, should not abridge freedom of the press. If the states wanted to abridge freedom of the press, that was their business. And even at that, a few years after the establishment of the Bill of Rights, the Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts and prosecuted 1 out of every 4 opposition editors of newspapers around the country. So at best, we would say they were ambivalent about the informed citizen and the newspapers. Should citizens gather together in civic associations and voluntary organizations and talk about politics? It seems like that's the essence, from our point of view, of what democracy is about, yet many of the founders opposed that. George Washington was very much opposed to people forming together on their own in civic associations to discuss politics. He said, that's the job of the Congress. You should not tell me, you and your environmental group or your National Rifle Association or your PTA, you should not tell me or the Congress what to do. How do you know? You haven't been in the Congress talking to the representatives of other people around the country. You haven't been in the deliberative body thinking through things. You're just talking to people who agree with you to begin with. That's no way to run a country. We've established this Constitution, an almost perfect government. Let it operate by sending respectable people to the Congress. Let them do their job. You stay out of it. This is stage 1 of American citizenship, in which the model citizen was a white male owning property and therefore a substantial person in his own right, and his job was to be deferential to the leaders of the community. Now, how did we get from there to a model very different as ice is from water, of the informed citizen? Well, there's a second stage. The second stage I call the era of the partisan citizen. And this is an era, most of the 19th century, in which parties governed, almost owned elections. Let me give you again a picture of what it was like to go to the polls in the 19th century. Nothing like the 18th century. In the 19th century, elections were a several months long process of organizing meetings and nominating meetings and torchlight processions and barbecues and parades. It was the best entertainment in town. People went out there to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, not necessarily because they wanted to hear Lincoln and Douglas, but because this was a celebration. This was a gala affair, and it was lots of fun. And on election day, what did you do? You woke up in the morning, possibly with a knock on the door from some party worker who had come to take you to the polls. Brought you to the polls. You might march in uniform after the Civil War, very often a military-like uniform, to show your connection to a social group, a party. And when you got to the polls, you received a ticket from a party worker. Piece of paper. A piece of paper had on it the names of that party's candidates for office. You didn't have to look at it. You didn't have to mark it. You didn't have to sign your name. You took that piece of paper and you put it in the ballot box. You didn't have to be literate. And you certainly didn't have to make some kind of careful choice among possibilities. Who's the Democrat? Who's the Republican? You were loyal to your party. You voted more or less by rote. And you let the party control matters, even to the printing of the ticket. There was no ballot. And the tickets were different enough so that it was very visible to everyone which party you were voting for. So if you were bribed, and this was not unusual in the 19th century, if you were bribed to vote, the briber would be able to know whether he'd spent his money well or not. It was not a secret ballot. The secret ballot came in, and let me move quickly here to stage 3 of American citizenship. You moved away from the party era, away from this enthusiastic, convivial, celebratory experience of politics in the 19th century, to the reform era, begins in the late 19th century. Some reformers say, politics has become too emotional. Politics is too enthusiastic. Politics should be more about information. It should be more about issues. It should be less about handing out your jobs to your friends and your cousins. And if that's to happen, we have to reform the system. We have to eliminate corruption. We have to weaken the parties and their hold on the whole process. So you got registration laws in this country for the first time. You got a tightening of laws about who is eligible to vote. In a number of states in the mid-19th century, you didn't have to be a citizen to vote. All you had to do was say, I intend to be a citizen, and you were eligible to vote. No longer after the 1890 reforms. The celebratory activities of politics that had brought people with their banners waving right up to the ballot box, now you had to stand back. You had to stop electioneering within 25 or 50 or 100 feet. All those laws, which we still have on the books in every state in the country, began in the period from 1890 to 1910, and a new ballot came in. It was called the Australian ballot. It began in Australia in the mid-19th century, and in almost every state in the Union between 1888 and 1896, the old ticket system was abandoned, the Australian ballot was adopted, and in the Australian ballot, because we still have it today, you know what went on. You receive a ballot printed by the state, not printed by the parties. You take it into a voting booth, and in secrecy, with your conscience alone and not party workers standing around you, you mark your ballot and make your choices. The idea is, at that point, that you're supposed to be an informed, rational, choosing, private citizen. That model of the informed citizen is in some ways still our model, but I want to add a fourth model. The model of the informed citizen assumes that the path to citizenship lies through the ballot box. A fourth model emerged beginning in the 1930s and coming to fruition in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. The fourth model is what I call the rights-regarding citizen. And the fourth model of citizenship says, the ballot box is one important way to be a citizen, but there's a second important way, and that's the courthouse. You can be a citizen not only by voting your conscience, but by suing the bastards. That might make a difference too, and that is a way to acknowledge and affirm your rights as an American. Now, let me give you an example of this. In the mid-1930s, the Supreme Court of the U.S. Had, in 1 year, 135 cases. Two of them concerned civil rights or civil liberties. Presently, some data from about 1990, again, about 130, 140 cases, half of them concerned civil rights or civil liberties. What was the Supreme Court doing back in the 30s? It was mostly dealing with powers. Who has power over something? Is it the state government or is it the federal government? Is it the Congress or is it the presidency? But there was a shift engineered most of all thanks to the civil rights movement, the NAACP, and other political activists who took citizenship into the courtroom. Now, what does that do? One thing that has done is to shift the emphasis in American politics toward a rights-centered citizenship. And that rights-centered citizenship brought to life the Bill of Rights that had been there all along. In that sense, it's still H2O, it's citizenship. But that rights-based citizenship was pretty much neglected in American history, at least until the 1930s, and in most respects until the civil rights movement came to its triumphs in the 1950s. What does that mean for us today? There's been criticism of the rights regarding citizen. There's criticism that this privatizes citizenship. It makes everything much too legalistic. It increases adversarialism in a world that should be much more communal. And there's something to that critique, it seems to me. But the other side really has to be recognized, and I think is not recognized nearly enough. And that is that notion of the communal, if it looks back to some golden age, looks back to an age that, if you take it far enough, is an age of white male property owners. White male property owners ran the country, were the appropriate citizens until a very late date. Women were excluded until the 1920s. African Americans were excluded until 1965. We forget today, looking at the problems we have that are severe, but we forget how recent is some of the expansion of American citizenship. And the expansion in the area of rights, pioneered by the civil rights movement, made a rights regarding consciousness available to lots of other people. So women, the elderly, gays and lesbians, children with learning disabilities, workers in the face of their employers, all have gained rights in this era, in the last 30 to 40 years, when they did not have rights before. To my mind, to think about citizenship today as constricting and reducing forgets that the realm of citizenship has spread into every corner of daily life. You can be a citizen at home. You can be a citizen in the workplace. You can be a citizen as you meet strangers in the street in ways that was not possible before because of this rights-based world that extends the norms of moral equality that are right back there in the Declaration of Independence, but makes them real in people's lives today. As you can probably hear, I'm sort of congenitally an optimist. I think there's a lot of progress that has happened in American life. At the same time, I want to stick to my metaphor of these changes of state. I don't think that citizenship is on the decline. I do think we have serious problems of citizenship today. What is an appropriate model for our day? That's really a question that's there at the end of my book, to which I don't have a complete answer. What I suggest, however, is that there are things to learn from each of our eras of citizenship. That in some sense, though we don't like to talk about it very often, deference is not such a bad thing. There's something to learn from the days of Madison and Jefferson and Washington, something to learn about delivering to others, representatives, some of the authority and some of the trust for running the country. I don't think we should let them do it all by themselves. I mean, there's a point to democracy. The crucialness of democracy is that you have contested elections on a regular basis. They need to be responsible to us. But we also need to be able to trust them. That's why the question of character returning to the American scene in recent years or months is an important one. There's something to learn from the colonial era. There's something to learn from the era of partisanship, too. I don't know what it's like here in Arizona, but in California we have a lot of local elections that are nonpartisan. There's no party label on the ballot. And I think most California citizens, like myself, don't know much about who those candidates are. We use that party label normally as a cue, as a source of quick information about whether we might or are likely to agree with that candidate or not. That nonpartisan election, like the initiative and referendum, came out of that same anti-party era of reform in the 1890s. It's had some good sides, but it has some bad sides, and it helps make citizens dumb. Party labels help make citizens smart. And partisanship and parties are something we can still learn from. The era of the informed citizen Rhetorically, that's still with us. We still think about, talk about, and expect one another to be informed citizens. I brought with me key instance of that. This is the California Voter Information Guide for this last election on Tuesday. It's 126 pages of rather dense prose. And the norm, we receive this in the mail. Every registered citizen, every registered voter receives this in the mail in California, which teaches us something. The idea is you're supposed to get through this. And if you don't, you haven't done your homework. And by the way, that was just for the general election. There was a primary. Same thing for the primary, 76 pages for the primary. And, by the way, those were just state matters. There's also local matters, another 67 pages for voters in San Diego County. Again, some of it's pretty dense. That's more, I hate to say this in a Barnes & Noble, but that's more nonfiction prose than most people read in a year. And we're supposed to read it, absorb it. It's not going to happen. It doesn't happen in California. It doesn't happen elsewhere. The model of the informed citizen needs to be tempered. And we need to start thinking about ways in which shortcuts to information and cues to information and even ceding some of our responsibility to gather information to experts, to voluntary associations, to partisan groups has to be part of our model of citizens. And the rights regarding citizen is very much an advance over other models of citizenship. We can't let go of it. There are problems about a litigious society. There are difficulties when everyone claims their rights and doesn't want to worry about their responsibilities or somebody else's rights. But it seems to me that the model of the rights regarding citizen is a crucial one, and that more often than not, when you think about your own rights, you are forced to think about what rights others might have too. We're in a time of transition. We're in a time of difficulty. Cultural authority in various ways seems to be on the wane. That's good news in that people are asserting their moral autonomy and their moral equality with other citizens. It's bad news as well because we don't always know where to turn. But that's the situation where we are now. And I think what we learn from looking at our history, what we learn is that we've been in times of transition before. We haven't fallen from grace or from a golden age, but we face difficulties and challenges just as Americans did in other times. And we have to know our own world and figure out what kind of citizenship can be appropriate to it. It's what I wanted to say by way of preface, and if there are questions or other thoughts, I'd be delighted to entertain them.
You talk about the four models of citizenship, but you don't talk about how you move from one model to the next. Could you talk about that, and also the last model, the rights model? You say we're in a time of transition. What do you see as sort of the model beyond that? It's sort of each one, the contradictions of one beget the next one. So what are we moving toward now, and sort of how did we get from one to the other?
Moving from one model to the next, the agent of change in moving from Model 1 to Model 2 is democratization in the broadest sense. The idea of equality in sort of Tocquevillian terms was unleashed, and more and more people said, we want a part of this political system. It was sort of in a way to organize that, this kind of cauldron of participation that was emerging in the early 19th century, that the party system began. These were the first political parties in the world. The first mass-based political parties in the world began in the United States before the Civil War. And their effort was to give some national order to the fact that more and more people were in fact participating in politics. The property requirement for voting disappeared. The idea of equality was abroad in the land, and it was making a big difference in every corner of life. Moving from the partisan era to the informed era was a complicated matter, but in a significant measure it had to do with this idea of a variety of reformers that politics had grown too enthusiastic. Now, part of this is that the reformers were not too crazy about some of the enthusiasts. Some of the enthusiasts were immigrants. Some of the enthusiasts were freed blacks in the South. And some of the reform efforts, though they had progressive elements, were also designed to restrict the franchise. And some of the reformers were very explicit about this. They said, it looks to us like the universal franchise that we thought was such a great idea way back when isn't such a great idea now, because our world is not as homogeneous as it was. And if you go back to the 18th century, it is clear in some of the founders' writings that they predicated the kind of republic that they called for on the assumption that everyone was sort of the same. And some of the reformers later and political leaders after the Civil War said, we're not the same anymore, and we don't trust the people who are different. So that was, in fact, part of the effort to keep elections rather more prim than they had been before. That's part of the effort. I mean, that's worth thinking about when we take the idea of the informed citizen as the be-all and end-all model. It has a rather checkered past. The movement from that, though again I say we're still in that era, but added to it, sort of somewhat additive model here, is the rights-regarding citizen, and that model emerges out of a variety of forces. One of them is in fact an international force. There are others, but let me just mention this one. It's an international factor. Adolf Hitler gave racism a very bad name. And people noticed that in our legal system and in the court system. And there began to be a shift toward taking the law to be something that should protect people who are otherwise defenseless in a majoritarian democracy. There's a very important footnote. It's the most important footnote in American history. It's footnote 4 in the Caroline Products versus U.S. case of 1938. The case itself is insignificant, but the footnote says that the Supreme Court should usually defer to the legislature, to that body which is closest to the people, to that body which is the most democratic. But there are 3 cases in which the Supreme Court should examine legislative activity with strict scrutiny. And one of those cases is when the law passed by the legislature concerns or affects or singles out what the court calls discrete and insular minorities. What that meant to the court is that the political system protects all of us so long as we are members of groups that have some opportunity to one day be in a majority. It's the Democrats this year, it's the Republicans next year. But if you're in a discrete and insular minority, you will never be in the majority, and it's possible for the majority to run ragged over your rights. The Supreme Court says in that case, we're real interested in keeping our eye on what the legislature is doing. Well, that was partly a response to what was going on in Europe at the time. And that combined with the ways in which World War II helped renew African Americans' sense of their entitlements, the fact of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People moving to a litigation strategy in the 1940s and 1950s, all of that helped catapult American public life into a new world in which rights began to be taken very seriously. Once that happened, then rights was like, I don't know what the right metaphor is, Kurt Vonnegut's Ice 9. Once you let it out, it starts spreading everywhere. One quick story about that. People who defend rights in one sphere wind up defending it in many spheres. There was a chemistry professor at Cornell named George Wiley in the 1960s. Wasn't very political. He taught chemistry. He published research articles in chemistry. He was the son of an African-American newspaper editor in Rhode Island, so he knew something about politics. He knew a lot about being a minority. And when the 60s hit, he still wanted to do chemistry, but some of his students said, we need you. We want you involved in campus politics. He got involved in campus politics. He found he had some talents for campus politics, and he wound up leaving his tenured position and becoming a leader at the Congress on Racial Equality, taking a job in Washington. He worked in the civil rights movement for several years. Then there were some disagreements there. He left CORE, and he founded a new organization called the National Welfare Rights Organization. In the long run of history, the NWRO is probably not the most successful organizing activity there ever was. But one thing that he did, he believed that welfare offices brought poor people together, that was a site in which you could organize people to stand up for their rights. But early in this effort, he said, you know, there's something missing about welfare rights. We don't have enough people on welfare. Now, in retrospect, that's sort of a funny thing to have said. You know, today everyone thinks we have too many people on welfare. He said, we don't have enough people on welfare. And he was right. That is, he was right in this sense, that there were welfare laws that entitled all kinds of people with a certain income, with a certain family pattern, to receive welfare benefits, and most of them never claimed those benefits, and some of them, when they claimed the benefits, were denied them because of the color of their skin. There were still, a lot of this was run through state offices, and welfare did not serve the people it was meant to serve. He said, we need more people on welfare, and I'm going to organize them once they're there. So he moved from civil rights to the rights of African Americans to the rights of the poor. Meanwhile, the American Hospital Association, you may not see the connection, but there's a connection. The American Hospital Association was coming up with new standards on how to run hospitals. And George Wiley noticed this, and he said, you haven't considered the patients in this. Let me tell you how to do it. And he wrote a patient's Bill of Rights and sent it to the American Hospital Association, and this was a magical era in American history, the late 60s, early 70s. The American Hospital Association adopted it. There were changes, but so he moved from teaching chemistry to rights of African Americans, to rights of the poor, to rights of patients. It's in that sense that we moved to new eras. Where are we going now, to get back to the other part of your question? I don't have a good answer to that. My provisional answer is that it's time, and I think there's a mood for rethinking what citizenship is and should mean. And when we do that, my claim is that we should learn something from all of these eras, that there might be some amalgam of them that makes for a better citizenship in the future. I don't know what that is. And in my sort of general sociological view that you arrive at a notion of citizenship fit somehow for that moment. I don't know what that will be. We live in a time where a lot of the traditional authorities, whether it be parents or teachers or clergy, don't get the same respect they once did. I think that's for better and for worse. One of the problems in looking back to a golden age of, say, the 1950s is that we trusted people too much. We gave too much respect to, for instance, physicians who were going to perform surgery on us without letting us know what the risks were. That happened a lot. It doesn't happen so much anymore because people claimed rights with respect to authorities. But it also makes it more difficult in some ways to practice medicine. So it's a complicated story. There have been gains and losses in each era. I think we have to find a form of citizenship. Well, let me say what. I don't even know if we have to find a new form of citizenship. I think it may already be here. But we're looking at the voting booth when it may be over at the courthouse. We're looking on election day where it may be in the ways in which men and women relate to one another on a basis of equality. We worry about the decline of the men's business clubs that helped, in their way, build a form of citizenship, provide the social order within which citizenship could flourish. But the men's clubs don't work the same way anymore because they're not just men's clubs. The women are in the business world too. And that makes a difference. It means we have to find some new organizational structures. I think that's probably happening. We just have to start knowing where to look. Other question?
Yes, you have quite a long career talking about issues around the media, and I'm kind of was curious how changes in the media, changes in technology, play such a small role in your historical account of changes in citizenship. And I was wondering if you could take a few minutes to reflect on how recent changes in technology around information media might affect how citizenship plays itself out.
This is an embarrassing question. I've written several books on the media, and you're right. In this book, the media play a secondary role. Let me say something why that might be. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the media, meaning primarily the newspapers, are really subsidiaries of political parties, you could say. They are one of the ways in which political parties talk to their members and talk to the people affiliated with them. Newspapers are also important in social movements as a kind of newsletter, in ways that they still are, in creating an association with national reach, even if there are only two other members of your abolitionist society in your own hometown. So the newspapers are important, but they're secondary to the political parties for much of American history. The modern era, the media become more and more central to how politics organizes itself. And at the same time, they're not central, I would claim, they're not central to the ways in which people get mobilized for action, the ways in which people come to claim a stake in their political world. This is because the media are mediated. It seems to me that people are most drawn to political involvement by other people. I think Sir Barbara Streisand should be the queen of sociology, from that old song about people who need people are the luckiest people in the world. People who need people are the only people in the world, it seems to me, and that's something that we don't remember often enough. That's how people get recruited into social movements. That's how people get recruited into political parties. They might get their attention drawn to something from the media. They might be impressed by a star, a celebrity, a politician, an issue in their own hometown even, they read about in the newspaper, here on TV, that might lead them somewhere. But it seems to me, even in our mediated age, it's connections with other people, with organizations through which you meet other people, that draws people more effectively than anything else into the political world. Now, what difference have all these changes in technology made? Well, I should say I'm not one who therefore thinks that the internet is going to suddenly democratize all of us. I think the internet's very useful, very helpful in all kinds of ways as an informational tool. It's not going to be the salvation of democracy. Although it reminds us, provides a new metaphor about networks and how networks, or in the words of another sociologist, Bob Wuthnow, loose connections characterize the ways in which people meet one another in our age. The internet may be helpful that way. Surely it will be. But the internet, like all other media of communication, will tend to get most use by the people who are already most advantaged in society. It's not, in the end, going to be an end run around that. Television. Television is, even in the internet age, the dominating medium of political communication today. Is this good or bad, and what does it do? Well, one thing it does in my own view, to ill effect is it draws all the monies from the political parties. Political parties used to subsidize voters, sometimes directly with bribes, sometimes a little less directly with drink, or a little less directly still with drama. I mean, someone had to pay for those uniforms that people, and the torches that people used in the 19th century. The parties paid for them. They put things in people's hands. They put buttons on people's lapels with party money. Now they subsidize broadcasters. There's been a decline in campaign buttons. There's been a decline in bumper stickers. All the money is going toward television. I think that's a terrible mistake. I think that's one of the ways in which the medium of television has, and the ways in which the parties have been willing to cooperate with it, has ill-served democracy. At the same time, I don't think the, say, Kennedy-Nixon debates was such a terrible falling off from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I know people are going to criticize me for that, but think about the Lincoln-Douglas debates for a minute. Huge numbers went out to these little Illinois towns. The first debate at I think it's Ottawa, if I'm not mistaken, Ottawa, Illinois, a town of 7,000. There were 10,000 people there. People came from surrounding country to hear the debate. Did they hear the debate? Well, two things. First of all, they didn't vote. No one who went there voted for Lincoln or Douglas. The U.S. Senate was elected indirectly. It was elected by the state legislatures. It waited for the reforms of the progressive year, 1913, before we elected senators directly. So no one who went there really had a direct say in whether Lincoln or Douglas was elected. Second, think about this. It's an August day, hot summer on the prairie in Illinois. Bees are buzzing. A lot of people there. People are opening their picnic baskets. The kids are crying, yelling, screaming. Who even heard Lincoln and Douglas? I mean, there weren't microphones. Who even heard them? The people in the front rows, no doubt. And what were they there to do? To cheer. And that's what they did. They cheered their champion. They jeered and booed and hissed at the other candidate. It was a wonderful event. I mean, it was a great moment in many ways of American democracy. But did anyone really learn anything? I mean, if you take our informed citizen model, they didn't have the informed citizen model there. They didn't go there to learn. They went there to support their team. The evidence we have on the Kennedy-Nixon debates is that people learned from the debates. You may also have turned it on because you were a Democrat and you wanted to see how Kennedy would slay Nixon, or you were a Republican and you wanted to see Nixon trounce this upstart. No doubt. But people learned things. Well, some of the things they said in the debates were not true, but to the extent that they were telling the truth about what the issues of the day were, it would have been very difficult to watch that first Kennedy-Nixon debate and not learn, if you didn't know it before, that Kennedy favored governmental, federal intervention in a variety of social problems, and Nixon opposed it. There was substance there, and it was available to lots of people, even if you didn't leave your living room to find out. So I think that was a great moment, and the presidential debates in general, with all of their faults, which are legion, are great moments for American democracy and a great use of television. I have much less favorable to say about some of the way television journalism works. Local television journalism is almost useless, in my own view, for improving American democracy. But my overall point, I think, here with the media is that the media are still one of the institutions of society. They've not replaced the parties. We talk in the Academy about the media as being the agenda setters of society. Not really. The political parties still tell you what your alternatives are when you go to the polls. If the political parties, if the Republican Party had not picked up Monica Lewinsky as an issue, the newspapers could have been talking about it till they were blue in the face. nothing would have happened. Nothing may happen anyway. But the parties are still the definers, the framers of what is legitimate political discourse here. And the media can push them and sometimes can adjust them a little bit here, a little bit there. But we have to not think of our society as only what comes into us at the eyes, only what comes into us at the ears. We have bodies. We live in situated worlds. We go to work. We have families. We eat. We sleep. All these things matter, and the way in which they are socially structured matter. The way we go to the polls matters, and the parties still command that. Other questions?
You have been discussing for some time the citizenship and the American democracy. And I'm thinking in terms of the most recent election where 35% of the people that were registered voted. Is that correct? 35%, I think it is. And I'm thinking that of the people that are eligible to be registered, maybe 40% are registered, which means that maybe 20% of the people that can vote, and 10% of them will vote Democrat, 10% of them will vote Republican. So we are being governed by 10% of the will of the people. And despite the fact that through the years citizenship has been expanded, it seems to me, only in breadth but not in depth, since still only a very small amount of people do make up their mind as to who will be the people that will govern us. So what does this thing do to our democracy? It seems to me that sometimes it is not very different than a dictatorship where the dictator is popular.
American democracy is still very different from a dictatorship, even with low voter turnout. Let me come to the statistics. There's an important point you make here, and the low voter turnout, though I would insist that it's not the only measure of the strength or health of our citizenship. It's not at all the only measure. It is one measure. And when turnout is low, this is not a good sign. People should vote, and I think that's very important. Where people don't vote in the U.S., and in this the U.S. is quite different from most industrial countries, is voting in the U.S. is well correlated with level of education and income. This is not true in many Western democracies, where the existence of a labor party or one of the major political parties strongly affiliated with labor mobilizes working class people and brings them to the polls. The Democratic Party has had elements of that, but it's never fully had a kind of labor agenda or close connection the way some European parties have. The result is not that American democracy has a chance of being a dictatorship, that it really makes a difference that you have contested elections and opposing parties. That really makes a difference, and a free press. All of that matters. And voluntary association, all the things that we have and that are precious, and some of which we invented in this country. But when you do have low voter turnout, it does tend to move the agenda of politics more toward the interests of the well-to-do. And so that the kinds of issues that get brought up, the kinds of agendas that the parties will promote are more likely to reflect the interests of the insiders than of the outsiders. Now, the amount of turnout is higher than you say. Most people who are eligible to register do register. I don't know exactly, but it's well more than half who are eligible to register do. And of those who register, in presidential elections, it is, if I'm not mistaken on this, 70 or 80% of the registered voters wind up voting. In California, I believe, in this off-year election, there was some people were expecting, I don't know what the final outcome was, we were expecting something like 60% of the registered voters voted. But that means that it's something in the 40% of the people eligible to vote voted. What can you say? Again, the only other industrial democracy with a record that bad in terms of turnout is Switzerland. One of the interesting things that Switzerland has in common with us is they have lots of elections. In most European democracies, elections are every 3 or 4 years, not twice every alternate year. There are very few local offices up for election. I mean, Americans vote in smaller percentages per election, but in terms of number of times they vote, it's actually quite a lot. And then some of the political scientists talk about voter fatigue in America. Now, what to say about that? I mean, it doesn't seem that hard to get out to vote. It's being made easier with increasing use of absentee ballots. There are other ways to make it easier as well, other reform proposals. Maybe we can vote over 2 days instead of 1. Maybe we can vote on weekends. Maybe there are other ways this could be done. Sunday voting is practiced in some countries. Compulsory voting is practiced in some countries. Belgium has very high voter turnout. Australia, very high voter turnout. They have compulsory voting. Interestingly, as I understand it, the penalties for not voting are very mild, and usually, I mean, all you have to say, well, I was sick, and then you can, or I had a sick kid, or you can get out of it. But the compulsory voting seems to establish a kind of norm that there's something wrong with you if you don't go. We don't have quite so strong a norm. But my main concern about low voter turnout is that not that it indicates ill health in general, but it distorts the political process because it's non-random. It's the poorer people who are not getting to the polls. That's why Democrats are almost always looking for high turnout, and Republicans are sometimes willing to say, gee, if turnout was a little lower, that wouldn't be so bad. I think we can, unless there's another question, I'm happy to thank you for your attention. And if you're interested in talking further, please come up after, and I'll sign books. Happy to do that. Barnes & Noble will be happy to sell them to you. It's fair to say in this world in which public and private are both important aspects of our lives, that they're libraries too. But I'd be happy to sign books.